Welcome to Chained Opinion. We're diving headfirst into a collection of freshly unveiled
Yeah,
documents
freshly unveiled.
surrounding the assassination of President John F. Kennedy.
Right.
This event, it continues to like loom large in American history. And I
It
think
does. Yeah.
the release of these files gives us a whole new lens to kind of examine this pivotal moment and the discussions it sparks, right?
Absolutely. The JFK assassination remains a subject of intense scrutiny, and it's had a really long and complicated history of investigations and interpretations. And this latest batch of declassified material really presents an opportunity to sort of dig deeper and potentially uncover new information, beyond what we already understand.
Okay, so these files, they've been released, right?
They have been released.
What's the story behind this? I understand it was like, started by a directive from a former president.
That's right. The release of these JFK assassination-related documents, it was set in motion by a previous presidential order.
Okay.
So in terms of the sheer volume, we're looking at like over 2,000 files that are now publicly available.
Wow.
But it is important to note that a significant portion of this material isn't entirely new to researchers.
Okay.
A lot of these documents, they were actually accessible before, but with certain sensitive details redacted, right? Like blacked out or hidden.
Right.
And so before this latest release, it was estimated that somewhere between like 3,000 to 3,500 documents were still not fully public. Like they weren't completely out there.
Oh, wow.
And just as an interesting tidbit, just prior to this release, the FBI, they actually identified approximately 2,400 additional JFK-related records that hadn't been previously known, which is pretty fascinating.
That's a lot.
It is.
So while, the number 2000 sounds huge,
It is, yeah.
the actual amount of brand new information might be less than, people initially thought, right?
Correct.
What are we hearing from, the people who've been immersed in this stuff for years? What's their take on this?
Well, from individuals who have been deeply involved in researching the assassination, like, for example, Jefferson Morley of the Mary Farrell Foundation, the release is generally viewed as a positive step, like a step in the right direction toward more transparency.
Okay.
Morley specifically highlighted what he described as like the elimination, the removal of what he calls rampant overclassification of relatively trivial information in the documents.
Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like it happens a lot where, they over-redact stuff
Uh-huh.
and it ends up just obscuring the understanding
Exactly.
rather than actually protecting anything sensitive. So in the grand scheme of things, how much of the previously hidden information does this release actually represent? Like, what's Morley's analysis on that?
So Morley, he estimates that this particular release accounts for like roughly 1/3
1/3. Okay.
of the JFK documents held by the National Archives that were previously redacted.
Okay.
So like numerically, he puts it at around 1,124 documents out of an estimated 3,500, that weren't fully public. So yeah, progress is being made, but there's still a lot of the historical record that remains either partially or fully restricted.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we're getting more pieces of the puzzle.
Uh-huh.
But it's still incomplete.
It's still incomplete.
All right. What are the main areas where Morley thinks these newly available files could shed some light?
Right.
What are the big questions that might potentially see some answers?
So Morley, he points to several key areas.
Yeah.
And these are areas that might offer some valuable insight.
Okay.
First of all, the nature of President Kennedy's relationship with and potential disquest of the CIA. Also, the various covert operations and alleged plots, to assassinate Fidel Castro.
Right.
But the surveillance activities that were directed at Lee Harvey Oswald during his time in Mexico City,
Yeah.
and the potential involvement of the CIA in propaganda efforts that might have involved Oswald in some way. These are all really, really central themes in trying to understand the events surrounding the assassination.
Right.
They really are at the core.
Yeah, these are like the core issues that still fuel a lot of debate.
Right.
And, fuel the development of different theories. But it's not just about researchers and historians, poring over these documents, right? What about the people who were actually named in these files?
Right.
How are they reacting to all of this being made public?
Yeah, that's an important consideration.
Yeah.
It seems that the release of these documents, has caused concern and unhappiness among some of the individuals whose personal information is included.
Yeah,
And understandably, they have anxieties related to their privacy.
of course.
And, the potential for their personal details to be, like, taken out of context. Or maybe even misused, given the intense historical interest in this event.
Absolutely. Has there been any official response to these privacy concerns? Is the government, doing anything to try to help these people out?
Yes. The White House has actually acknowledged these concerns,
Okay.
and they've stated that measures are being put in place, to assist those whose personal information has been disclosed.
Good.
So this includes things like providing credit monitoring services,
Okay.
facilitated through the National Archives,
Mm.
and also a process for individuals to obtain, like, new Social Security numbers if their original numbers were, like, released in the document.
Right, right.
So yeah,
That's good.
it indicates that they're at least aware of the potential repercussions, of making all this information public.
Yeah. It's a responsible step.
It is, yeah.
All right, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about what these files reveal about the Soviet Union's perspective on Lee Harvey Oswald.
Okay.
What do these documents tell us about how the KGB viewed Oswald?
Well, one really interesting revelation
Hmm.
comes from a document that details, like, a review
Okay.
that was conducted by a KGB official named Nikonov.
Nikonov.
Yeah.
All right.
And this review, it specifically looked at Soviet intelligence files that were related to Lee Harvey Oswald.
Okay.
And the key takeaway from this internal KGB assessment was that Lee Harvey Oswald, he was never an agent, like operating under the control of the KGB.
Okay, so according to their own intelligence, they didn't see him as one of their guys.
Correct.
But I'm guessing there's more to the story, right? There's got to be more details about their interactions with him.
Yeah, absolutely. The same document, it purportedly contains a memo
Okay.
indicating that while the KGB did, keep some degree of surveillance on Oswald,
Right.
while he was living in the Soviet Union, they had serious doubts about anyone being able to actually control him.
Interesting.
Yeah, it suggests that they saw him as, like, an unpredictable individual.
Okay.
And to add another layer to this, the file apparently noted that Oswald, he actually performed poorly
Really?
during target practice while he was in the Soviet Union, which,
Wow.
when you think about what happened in Dallas, it's a pretty striking contrast.
Yeah, that's a big discrepancy. It
Yeah.
really highlights, the complexity.
The complexity, yeah.
And the lingering contradictions within this whole story. We also have some insights from Dan Johnston, who has a lot of experience looking at intelligence agencies. What's his interpretation of these released files?
Okay, so Dan Johnston, he served as a staff member on the Church Committee.
Okay.
And the Church Committee was, the Senate committee that investigated intelligence abuses back in the 1970s.
Right.
So he offers, like, a more cautious interpretation of the significance of these released documents.
Okay.
His perspective is that if these files contained truly damaging information, really incriminating stuff, especially for an agency like the CIA, it's likely those documents just wouldn't have been released.
Right. It's a very pragmatic, maybe even cynical viewpoint,
Yeah.
but, it comes from someone who understands how these agencies work
Exactly.
and the nature of classified information. Does he point to any specific documents that he thinks are still being kept from the public?
He does. He specifically mentions the initial private conversation
Okay.
that happened between President Lyndon B. Johnson and then CIA Director John McCone
Right.
immediately after President Kennedy's assassination.
Wow.
And he believes that the record of that conversation, that very important exchange, along with some other potentially significant documents that he's aware of, have not been made public. Which, really raises questions about what information is still being hidden.
Absolutely. And the reasons for keeping it hidden.
It's
Sometimes what's not there is just as telling. Now, let's move on to a different line of thinking that's emerging. There's this perspective that suggests that these released files actually vindicate the views of, the people who've always questioned the official story
Right.
about the assassination.
Right.
What's your take on that?
So this viewpoint, you often find it in online discussions,
Yeah.
alternative media, things like that.
Okay.
And it essentially posits that individuals who have been labeled, as conspiracy theorists, they were actually right in their assessments of the situation.
Interesting.
And it kind of redefines, like, what the term conspiracy theorist actually means. suggesting that it now applies to people who have done their own research on the topic,
Mm.
and they've come to conclusions that maybe differ from the mainstream account.
Right. So it's like a shift in the language,
It is.
around these discussions. So what are the main arguments that this perspective is putting forward,
Okay.
now that we have this new information?
Well, this perspective often references President Eisenhower's farewell address,
Okay.
particularly his warning about the potential dangers of the military-industrial complex.
Hmm.
And they argue that this powerful, unelected entity, they say, played a really significant role in the events leading up to and surrounding the assassination.
Okay.
And they suggest that Kennedy himself was against endless war,
Right.
and he was actively trying to limit the influence of this complex.
So this idea of Kennedy being in conflict
Yes,
with, powerful entrenched interests.
exactly.
This is something that comes up a lot.
It does. It's a recurring theme.
In a lot of alternative theories, are there any specific actions or policies of Kennedy's that they point to?
They do.
Okay.
One of the key claims that comes up within this perspective is that President Kennedy's Department of Justice, they demanded that the American Zionist Council, which later became AIPAC,
Right.
register as a foreign agent
Okay.
under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA.
FARA. All right. For our listeners who might not know, could you explain what FARA is?
Sure. So the Foreign Agents Registration Act, it's a United States law
Okay.
that requires individuals or entities acting as agents of foreign principals within the U.S. to register with the Department of Justice.
Right.
And they have to disclose information about their activities, their funding, their communications.
Okay.
And the basic aim of FARA is to promote transparency regarding, foreign influence
Right.
on American policy and public opinion.
Okay. So basically, they're saying that the Kennedy administration believed that the American Zionist Council was working on behalf of a foreign government, specifically Israel,
Right.
and therefore they had to register under this act.
Exactly.
Okay.
And to support this claim, this perspective, it often presents a very detailed chronological account of events, suggesting that in October of 1962, the Assistant Attorney General formally notified Robert F. Kennedy, who was the Attorney General at the time, of their intention to request the ASC's registration under FARA.
Right.
And then by the next month, November of 1962, the DOJ, they allegedly issued a formal order for this registration.
Okay, so they made it official. What was the American Zionist Council's response to this demand?
The timeline suggests that the president of the ASC then requested a 120-day delay in the registration process. And during this time, in January of 1963, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee,
Right.
AIPAC, was incorporated.
AIPAC.
Yeah. And after this incorporation, the ASC Council, they reportedly informed the Department of Justice about the creation of this new organization.
Okay. Sounds like a strategic move.
It does, doesn't it?
Maybe trying to avoid that registration requirement.
Right.
By creating a new entity, did the Department of Justice see this as, a good enough solution?
According to this perspective, no.
No.
The Department of Justice continued to press for the FARA registration
Really?
of the American Zionist Council.
Okay.
And this ongoing pressure, it reportedly led to concerns being raised by different figures, including Donald Rumsfeld, who was a congressman at the time. And these concerns, they centered around the potential backlash from, American Jewish Zionist public opinion if this registration actually went through. And the claim is that in October of 1963, just weeks before the assassination, the DOJ issued a demand to the ASC requiring a response regarding the FARA registration within 72 hours.
Wow, that's a pretty tight deadline.
It is.
Especially considering the sensitivity of the issue. So close to the assassination, too. What conclusions does this perspective draw from this chain of events, and then the assassination happening?
Right. So the implication is that this intense pressure on Zionist organizations regarding the FARA registration, it just kind of disappeared after Kennedy's assassination. And this viewpoint often highlights Lyndon B. Johnson's very strong pro-Israel stance.
Oh, okay.
The president who succeeded Kennedy.
Right.
And they often cite an Israeli newspaper article that described Johnson as, quote, the president who is most uniformly friendly to Israel. And even quoted Johnson as saying to an Israeli diplomat after Kennedy's death, quote, you have lost a very great friend, but you have found a better one.
Wow. That's a pretty stark contrast
It is, yeah,
to what the Kennedy administration was allegedly doing.
right.
It definitely raises questions about potential shifts in, policy and influence after their assassination. This viewpoint also dives into some pretty big historical claims.
It does.
Right.
It does. This line of inquiry, it extends to some assertions made in Ami magazine
Okay.
regarding alleged blackmail involving prominent figures like the Rockefeller family and the Dulles family
Hmm.
and their supposed ties to Nazi Germany.
Wow.
And the suggestion is that this alleged blackmail was used, to influence the creation of the State of Israel.
Okay.
And the author of the Ami magazine article, he actually claims that his fictionalized book
Hmm.
on this very complex subject
Right.
has faced, obstacles to being published in the United States.
Those are some really serious allegations.
They are.
I think it's important for our listeners to remember that these are claims, these are things being discussed,
Right.
and they haven't been independently verified.
Correct.
What else does this perspective, this viewpoint, kind of encompass?
Well, it also brings into the discussion a statement attributed to a former prime minister of Israel
Okay.
who allegedly discussed how Zionist individuals, they were trained to edit Wikipedia entries
Oh, wow.
to ensure what he described as a, quote, balanced and Zionist perspective on the online encyclopedia.
That's concerning.
It is.
That's a platform that so many people rely on for information.
Exactly.
To think that there could be manipulation happening
Right.
on that level is it's a bit unsettled. So to put it all together, it seems like the release of these JFK files
Yeah.
hasn't just given us new information, it's reignited old debates
Uh-huh.
and provided fuel for different interpretations of what happened.
Absolutely.
Back on November 22, 1963.
Yeah. We're seeing a wide range of reactions, from people being cautiously optimistic about the government being more transparent to, the resurgence of these alternative narratives that try to connect the assassination to, bigger geopolitical contexts and, these hidden influences that might have been at play.
Right. So we've gone through a lot here. We've talked about the release of these documents related to the JFK assassination.
Right.
The fact that, a lot of this material was originally redacted.
Uh-huh.
The personal impact this is having on people named in the files, the privacy concerns.
Yeah.
And how these documents are feeding both traditional historical analysis
Right.
and, those alternative interpretations of the assassination,
Absolutely.
as well as related international dynamics.
Yes.
So as we wrap up this exploration, this brings up an important point for our listeners. Think about the inherent complexities of major historical events. What does real transparency even mean? Can we ever truly achieve it, especially when we're dealing with things like national security and huge political upheavals? And as individuals, how do we critically evaluate all of this? How do we navigate between official accounts and these persistent alternative narratives,
Right.
when we're trying to understand crucial moments in history?
Exactly. It's a conversation that needs to continue.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive,
Yeah.
this complex exploration. If you found it insightful, please remember to share, subscribe, and leave us a comment on Chained Opinion.
Yeah, let us know what you think.
We really appreciate you joining us today. You can also find us, in audio podcast form on YouTube Music and Spotify.
That's right.
Thank you for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.